One of the more disturbing aspects of the genocide, there are obviously several layers to it, not the least of which is the embodiment of it all, which was in Rajab, the murdering of innocent children, of course, bombing of hospitals, hospital workers. But I think perhaps the most unheralded aspect of Israel's genocide that we have aided and abetted for not just the last 2.5 years, but the entire project for the past 75, is we are also faced with the prospect of the disintegration of the First Amendment, not just here at home, but abroad. And the freedom of the press being that killing journalists has become somewhat of a sport in many respects by Israel. They like to fancy themselves as silencing dissent in the worst possible way. World War II, Vietnam, you name it. Journalists were allowed to cover what was going on. Israel does not believe in you covering what was going on. And I'm sure you're aware of the story that just happened earlier this afternoon. UK journalist Steve Sweeney just missed that bomb, just missed it. Here's what happened in southern Lebanon earlier today.
The rocket attacks were reported against Nahariya and a minute. Fucking hell. Fuck.
Yeah.
Where?
Aftershock.
Yeah. Insane.
Yes, so. Yeah, well, you've probably all seen the footage of the airstrike that took place in Sur district as we were reporting on the destruction of a bridge. We've been treated in hospital for our injuries. I had a shrapnel wound in my arm, deeply embedded in the muscle here. That's been taken out, and here it is in this pot here. But what I do want to say is that this was a deliberate, targeted attack on journalists. There's no mistake about it. This was an Israeli precision strike from a fighter jet. What we were doing was we were reporting on the attacks on bridges, which is effectively severing South Lebanon from the rest of the country. 1 million people now internally displaced. This is the real story. It's not about us coming under attack as journalists. What we're seeing now and what we were reporting on is this plan for Israel to ethnically cleanse the south of Lebanon. This is without doubt an attack. This is on the scale or bigger than the scale of the Nakba. This is the forced displacement of 1 million people, which remains a war crime. And also we have to say that attacking journalists is a war crime. Attacking civilian infrastructure is a war crime. But if they think that they're going to silence us, if they think that we're going to stay out of the field, they're very, very much mistaken.
I have to say, Craig, a couple of things stand out to me from this in particular.
I know what stands out to me, but you'll get mad if I put up my graphic, but
Well, what were you going to say?
That's some of this going on here, man. That is kudos to that man. He is a sequoia. Okay. Well, kudos to the sequoia. I'm sorry, but this guy just got, and now he's back. I'm sorry. All right, continue.
I agree, by the way. He puts a lot of his Western journalist colleagues to absolute shame. The number of so-called journalists in the West who decided to strictly be stenographers for power in Washington and Tel Aviv, even as their own colleagues have been picked off one by one and now into the hundreds in Lebanon and in Palestine, is absolutely shocking. And here's a guy committing the crime of journalism and almost being killed for it.
Well, you would think that over the past 2.5 years, particularly as many as 200 plus journalists have been killed by Israel, and not killed accidentally, targeted specifically. They have the press jacket on. We want them dead. We don't care if they're Muslim or not. If you've got that press jacket on and you're trying to expose our war crimes, we will kill you. And the U.S. State Department will protect us, so we don't really have any consequences to worry about. Not only was this a very brave act by Steve Sweeney, who said, I'm going to cover what is an attempt to, I guess, blow up a bridge by Israel so that way supplies can no longer be brought into this part of Lebanon. They're attempting to do as they did in Gaza, as they're now doing in the West Bank. What do you expect will happen if you do not attempt to stop this, if you just allow it to continue? And what should probably not come as any surprise, as I'm sure you probably observed as well, is the responses to Steve Sweeney this afternoon, particularly by that of the Hasbara. Well, if we wanted to kill you, we could have killed you.
I love that. That's the best confession ever. They always do that. That's really good. But that's like, that was like Debbie Wasserman Schultz. If we wanted to cheat, we would have. Like, I love that.
Yeah. I mean, it's actually, I think, very indicative of how there is no morality in these sorts of judgments anymore, that, all of the rules have gone out the window. And this is what people who don't care about Palestine and Lebanon and so on, this is a hard lesson they're going to learn, because what is being destroyed in Western Asia is not just Palestinian and Lebanese lives and infrastructure. It is the very notion of international law, of international institutions, of rules, of common decency, of human morality. The gloves are off. The paragraph that you read in the opening, Jen, that's what I was trying to capture there as well, that what's happening here is very dangerous for everyone. And the Palestinians have learned it, where Israel has broken by a wide margin every record for the murder of journalists. And as Peter says, not as collateral damage, but tracked and monitored and assassinated, often along with their families, one after another, and now into the hundreds. The same thing happening in Lebanon. To see a Western journalist with that happening, maybe some folks who don't see journalists from the region as human beings who are in journalists will be shocked enough. I mean, I suspect they're not going to see this reel very often in corporate media, but who knows? By what people in the region could have told you forever. The other great myth that you hear in the U.S. repeated over and over again is that Israel is a democracy, and not just a democracy, but the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel is not now, has never been, and could not be a democracy. You cannot have an ethno-supremacist regime that is exclusionary, that excludes, in fact, numerically more people than it includes, if you count the people who have been forced into exile, the people who are in all of the different parts, 1948 areas, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and so on, that the majority by a margin is excluded from the polity. That's not a democracy, but it's not a democracy in other ways. You cannot have rights if you're not a privileged member of that society. There is no free press. There never has been. One of the first things I learned when I arrived there in the 1980s was that everything goes through a strict regime of military censorship, to which Western media corporations subject themselves without comment or controversy, and report in the U.S. Accordingly. So, when you have a regime that has broken the records for the killing of journalists, broken the records for the killing of humanitarian workers, broken the records for the killing of medical personnel, in targetings, not in collateral damage, that has picked off every hospital and school and clinic and church and mosque one by one by one. It's not a place where you can talk about these kinds of values in a serious way. And at the center of all of this is that the Israeli project is a project of impunity. Israel has not been and must not be, from their perspective, ever held accountable for any of its actions. And the entire U.S. political system is dedicated to the proposition that Israel will not be held accountable. If you've ever taken the time to listen to the Senate hearings when they are confirming U.S. ambassadors to the UN, you will see that the centerpiece of those inquiries is, will you make sure that Israel is not held accountable for any of its crimes? Will you defend Israel? Not the U.S. Will you defend Israel in the United Nations? And because of that impunity, because Israel has enjoyed absolute impunity for 80 years, including, as I said, with regard to the highest rules of international law, that has emboldened it to do things like hand out golden pagers commemorating a transnational terrorism attack as a kind of boast and a reward to others who have been in one way or another complicit with the regime. That is, empowered it to continue its serial aggression, its assassinations across the region, its meddling in U.S. domestic politics. By the way, giving orders that were quickly followed up on to annul the First Amendment of the Constitution in the US
Yeah.
and to persecute students and peace activists and human rights defenders and professors, to go so far as to kick them out of school, to end the tenure of professors, to beat people with police, to arrest them, to have them be fired, to deport them, simply for telling the truth in public about a genocide being perpetrated by the Israeli regime with the backing of the U.S. government. That's how deeply dedicated to Israeli impunity the United States government and a lot of institutions here, corporations, media, and others, the tech oligarchs in Silicon Valley, all of them absolutely dedicated to that cause. And that's why we have seen that despite the fact that corporate media in the U.S. has been, as I've said, stenographers for Israeli Zionism and U.S. power, because it wasn't absolute enough. You now see things like, pro-Israel billionaires purchasing CBS and Paramount and lining up the bids to buy CNN and taking over TikTok. They forced the sale of TikTok so that it could be controlled by pro-Israel billionaires, so that young people in particular would not hear the truth about the Israeli regime. That's the country we live in right now, thoroughly dedicated not to the cause of international law, decency, or even to the interests of the people of the United States, but to the cause of Israeli impunity that has now led to aggression, genocide, and puts us all at risk even of nuclear war. Remember, Israel is is the one country in the Middle East, in Western Asia, that not only has nuclear weapons, but undeclared, unsupervised nuclear weapons, achieved in large measure through espionage against the United States and France in order to build that program, and in a country where the government is dedicated to an ideological process that is deeply racist, fundamentally violent, necessarily expansionist, and threatens all of us in the end with those kinds of weapons. That's what our government is dedicated to, our corporations, our media.